She was 52 years old, married for 28 years. And that Tuesday morning, sitting at the breakfast table, he asked her where she was going. She looked at him, took a breath, and simply said, "I'm going out." Nothing more. No explaining where, no justifying why, no saying what time she'd be back. He stood there, coffee cup in hand, waiting for the rest of the sentence that never came. Because for the first time in nearly 3 decades, she didn't justify herself. And in that 10-second silence, something shifted in their dynamic, something that would never be the same again. Nilda Chiaraviglio spent 15 years studying a specific pattern in mature women. She noticed that there's a turning point in the lives of certain women, a moment where they simply stop explaining, stop justifying, stop apologizing for existing. And when that happens, the reaction from the men around them is almost always the same: panic, disguised as sudden interest. Because a man who has had you available, explaining every move, justifying every choice, suddenly finds himself facing a stranger who lives in the same house, who shares the same bed, but who he no longer controls. What you're about to discover isn't about manipulation. It's not about playing games. It's about something much deeper and much more powerful. It's about what happens in male psychology when a mature woman decides she no longer owes anyone an explanation for her life, and why that's the most potent aphrodisiac there is. Let's go back to that 52-year-old woman. Her name is Elizabeth, a retired lawyer, 2 grown children, a marriage she described as good. No major problems, no affairs, just emptiness. She told me that for 28 years, every time she left the house, she explained where she was going, why, how long she'd be gone, who she'd be with. Not because he demanded it. He never demanded it. She did it because she always had. Since she was 24, when she got married, she believed that a good wife keeps her husband informed, updated, reassured. But in a counseling session, at 51 years old, the therapist asked a simple question: "Why do you explain yourself so much?" Elizabeth didn't know how to answer. The therapist insisted. "Does he ask for these explanations?" "No." "Does he get angry if you don't explain?" "No." "Then why do you do it?" And Elizabeth realized she did it because she was afraid. Afraid of what? Afraid that if she didn't justify every move, he'd think she was hiding something, that she didn't love him, that she didn't care, that she was drifting away. So she spent her whole life explaining herself to prove she deserved to be there, to prove she was a good wife, a good woman. And it was in that moment that Elizabeth made a decision. She was going to stop. Not overnight. Gradually. First, she stopped explaining where she was going in the middle of the afternoon. Then, she stopped justifying why she wanted to have dinner alone at a restaurant. Then, she stopped apologizing for not being available when he wanted to talk. And with each justification, she stopped giving. Something strange happened. He became more attentive, more present, more interested. Nilda explains the phenomenon like this. Men, especially mature men, are driven by 2 fundamental instincts when it comes to relationships. First, the instinct to conquer. Second, the fear of loss. When a woman is always available, always explaining, always justifying, those 2 instincts go dormant because there's nothing to conquer and nothing to lose. She's right there. Guaranteed, transparent, predictable. And the male brain doesn't value the predictable. It values what he needs to decipher, what he needs to earn, what he can lose. When Elizabeth stopped explaining herself, She became a mystery again. Not a forced mystery. Not a game of cat and mouse. But a genuine mystery. Because for the first time in 28 years, he didn't know exactly what she was thinking, what she was feeling, what she would do next. And that awoke something in him that had been asleep for decades. Curiosity. And curiosity, in a mature man, quickly translates into desire. 3 weeks after Elizabeth started the change, her husband did something he hadn't done in years. Asked if she wanted to go out to dinner. Not just anywhere, but the restaurant where they had their first date, 30 years ago. She accepted, but not with exaggerated enthusiasm. She just accepted. During dinner, he was different. Attentive, curious, asked questions about what she was reading, about what she was thinking, about how she was feeling. Questions he hadn't asked in so long that Elizabeth couldn't even remember when the last time had been. And then he said something revealing. "I feel like I don't know you anymore." Elizabeth could have panicked, could have explained herself, could have reassured him that nothing had changed, that she was still the same. But she didn't. She just smiled and said, "Maybe you never really knew me." And the expression on his face was that of someone who had just realized they were in the presence of a fascinating stranger, a stranger he wanted to know. Again. Now, let's understand the psychology behind this. Nilda has identified that women who constantly justify themselves are, without realizing it, communicating 3 things to the male brain. First, I need your approval. Second, I'm afraid of losing you. Third, I don't trust my own worth. And the male brain, upon receiving those 3 messages, responds in a very specific way. It relaxes. Because if you need his approval, if you're afraid of losing him, if you don't trust in your own worth, he doesn't need to do anything. You're already conquered. Already guaranteed. And what's guaranteed doesn't require effort. But when you stop justifying yourself, you reverse those 3 messages. Now you communicate, I don't need your approval. I'm not afraid of losing you. I fully trust in my own worth. And the male brain, upon receiving these new messages, goes on alert. Because now he needs to know. If she doesn't need me, why is she with me? If she's not afraid of losing me, what's keeping her here? If she trusts in her own worth, am I still enough for her? And these questions create something that didn't exist before. Tension and tension. In mature relationships is what separates partners from siblings. Let's talk about another woman. Michelle. 56 years old. Divorced for 3. Started dating a 58-year-old man. Retired engineer. Widower. In the first few months, Michelle did what she had always done in previous relationships. She explained herself. If he asked where she was, she explained in detail. If he suggested something and she didn't want to do it, she justified for 10 minutes why she couldn't. If she took a while to respond to a message, she apologized and explained that she was busy. And the dynamic between them was lukewarm. He was polite, attentive, but there was no fire. There was no urgency, no sense that he needed her. Until Michelle attended a lecture by Nilda Chiaraviglio and decided to put it to the test. The following week he texted, "Where are you?" Normally Michelle would have replied, "I'm at the grocery store picking up some produce, then I'm stopping by the pharmacy before heading home." But this time, she simply replied, "Out." He waited. Nothing more. 2 hours later, he called. "Everything okay?" "Yes, everything's great." "Where were you?" "Just taking care of a few things." And the conversation ended there. Michelle recounts feeling an enormous sense of guilt. because she had been conditioned her entire life to believe that not giving explanations was rude, or worse, that it signaled she was hiding something. But she followed Nilda's advice. Don't justify yourself. Not because you're hiding something, but because you owe no one an explanation of your private life, not even the man you love. You aren't a child answering to your parents. You're a complete woman who chooses to share her life with someone. Sharing isn't the same as asking for permission. Sharing isn't the same as justifying yourself. 3 days later, the engineer invited Michelle to dinner. Midway through the meal, he said, "I feel like you're distant." Michelle could have gone into explanation mode, could have reassured him that no, everything was fine, that she loved him. But she did something different. She said, "I'm not distant. I'm just being myself, without apologies." And he was silent for almost a minute. And then he said something Michelle didn't expect. "I like that. I like not knowing everything about you. It makes you seem interesting again." Interesting again. Those 3 words say it all. Because what he was confessing was that when Michelle explained herself all the time, she ceased to be interesting. She became an open book, a book he had already read. But when she stopped justifying herself, she became a book with secret chapters. And he wanted to read it. He wanted to discover it. He wanted to earn access to those chapters. Nilda says that this is the most common mistake of mature women in relationships. They think total transparency is a sign of trust. And to a certain extent, it is. But excessive transparency is different. Excessive transparency is when you give up your mystery, when you hand everything over on a silver platter, when you remove all curiosity. And without curiosity, what's left? Comfort. And comfort, while important, isn't enough to keep a mature man emotionally invested. Mature men need something that challenges them mentally, something they need to decipher, something that makes them wonder, do I really know her? And women who stop justifying themselves create exactly that challenge. Now, let's talk about a third woman. Susan, 61 years old, married for 35 years. She wrote to me after applying what Nilda teaches. She said, "For 35 years, I justified everything. If I bought a piece of clothing, I explained why I bought it, how much it cost, where I was going to wear it. If I went out with my girlfriends, I would give him a week's notice, confirm on the day, and text him every hour. If I wanted to change something in the house, I presented arguments as if I were defending a doctoral thesis. I lived begging for permission to exist in my own life. And my husband? My husband did whatever he wanted. He went out when he wanted. He bought what he wanted. He changed what he wanted. Without explanations, without justifications. And I thought this was normal, that men are like that women need to explain, and men don't. But at 60, Susan had an insight. She realized that this dynamic wasn't about gender. It was about power. And she had given all the power to him without even realizing it. Because whoever justifies themselves is in a position of inferiority. Whoever justifies themselves is saying, I need your approval to do what I want to do. And whoever receives the justifications is in a position of superiority, is saying, I evaluate whether what you do is acceptable or not. According to Padre Pio, it is up to each to make their own choices in life. So, Susan stopped everything. She bought a new outfit. He asked, "New clothes?" She replied, "Yes," and continued reading her book. He waited for more. Nothing else came. "Where are you going to wear it?" "Wherever I want to." "But," "Nothing but. It's clothing." "I bought it. End of story." And he was disconcerted. Because in 35 years, she had never done that. She always explained, always justified, always asked for implicit approval. A week later, Susan announced that she was going on a trip with her friends. He asked, "Where to?" To the beach. When? Next week. For how many days? 4. And nothing. Everything is already organized. And again, he was left not knowing what to do with the lack of information. He tried to argue. But we didn't talk about this. There's no need to talk. I decided. I'm going. But what if I have plans? You can make your plans. I have mine. And this was the first time in 35 years that Susan put her plans on the same level of importance as his plans, without justifying herself, without apologizing, without asking for permission. His reaction? In the first few weeks, anger disguised as concern. He said he was worried about her, that she was different, that maybe she needed counseling. But Susan, with the wisdom of someone who has already lived more than 60 years, realized he wasn't worried about her. He was afraid of losing control, afraid that if she no longer needed his approval, maybe she wouldn't need him anymore. And it was exactly this fear that changed everything, because fear of loss is the most potent engine of change in mature men. 3 months after Susan stopped justifying herself, her husband started doing things he hadn't done in years. He asked her opinion. He consulted her before deciding things. He complimented her. He planned surprises. Why? Because now he was insecure. And insecurity generates effort. And effort generates emotional investment. And emotional investment is what keeps a 35-year marriage alive. Nilda has a theory about this. She says that long relationships enter a dangerous comfort zone. Dangerous not because it's bad, but because excessive comfort kills desire. And what kills desire faster is predictability. When a man knows exactly how you're going to react, what you're going to say, where you're going to be, his brain shuts off. Because there's no novelty, no surprise, no discovery. And the male brain, especially after 50, needs novelty to stay engaged. But here's the secret that Nilda discovered. You don't need to become someone else. You don't need to create drama. You don't need to invent mysteries. You just need to stop explaining yourself. Because when you stop explaining yourself, you automatically become less predictable. Because he no longer knows what to expect. He no longer knows how you're going to react. He no longer knows what you're thinking. And that creates space. Space for him to wonder. Space for him to worry. Space for him to rise to the occasion. Now, I know what you're thinking. Isn't this some kind of game? Isn't it manipulation? And the answer is no. Because manipulation is when you do something with the intention of controlling another person. Stopping the over-explaining? That's not about controlling him. It's about respecting you. It's about recognizing that you don't owe anyone an explanation for your life. It's about understanding that you are a complete woman with desires, plans, thoughts, and feelings that are yours, and that sharing your life with someone doesn't mean giving up your privacy. It doesn't mean surrendering your mystique. It doesn't mean relinquishing your power. Let's talk about cases where this didn't work. Because yes, those exist. Nilda Chiaraviglio has documented hundreds of women who implemented this change. And in 12% of the cases, the man didn't react well. Not because the technique was flawed, but because the relationship was already dead. And what the lack of justification did was simply accelerate the end. But Nilda says that's not failure. That's revelation. Because if a man only stays with you because you constantly justify yourself, because you ask for permission, because you're in a position of inferiority, then he doesn't love you. He controls you. And a relationship based on control isn't a relationship. It's a prison. And mature women don't have time for prisons. There's one woman who really stood out to me. Eleanor, 54 years old, married for 26. She applied everything Nilda teaches. Stopped justifying herself. Stopped over-explaining. Stopped asking for implicit permission. And her husband was furious, not worried, not insecure, furious. He would yell, say she was crazy, that she was being selfish, that she wasn't thinking about him, that she wasn't thinking about the family. And Eleanor realized something she'd denied for 26 years. He didn't want a partner. He wanted a subordinate. And when she stopped subordinating herself, the relationship crumbled. She told me. I was scared, because I didn't know if I could start over at 54. But then I realized I was already alone within a marriage. And loneliness within a marriage is worse than real solitude. Because at least when you're truly alone, you have the chance to find someone who values you. Alone within a marriage, you're trapped. Eleanor got divorced. 6 months later, she started dating a man of 61. And from the beginning, she applied the rule, no justification. He would ask where she was. She'd answer simply. He'd suggest something she didn't want. She'd decline without justifying. He'd try to press for more information. She wouldn't budge. And the dynamic between them was completely different. It was light. It was respectful. It was balanced. Because he understood from the outset, this woman doesn't ask permission. This woman doesn't justify herself. This woman knows her worth. And if I want to be with her, I need to respect that. Now, let's talk about something more subtle. Something Nilda Chiaraviglio calls emotional justification. This is when you don't justify your actions, but you justify your feelings. Example: he does something that hurts you, and you, instead of simply saying that you're hurt, you explain for 20 minutes why it hurt you. You give context. You give examples. You practically write a dissertation on your feelings. Why? Because you want him to understand. You want him to validate your pain. You want him to say, you have a right to feel that way. But here's the problem. When you justify your feelings, you are, unintentionally, asking permission to feel them. You're saying, I only have the right to be hurt if you agree that what you did was wrong. And that puts your emotional well-being in his hands. And mature women don't do that. Mature women say, I'm hurt. Period. No explanation. No justification. Because feelings don't need justification. You feel what you feel. And that's valid. Always. There's a story Nilda tells. A woman of 58. Married for 32. Her husband forgot her birthday. Again. For the 5th time in 10 years. And she, as she always did, was hurt in silence. He realized 2 days later. Asked, Are you upset? She, as she always did, said, No, everything's fine. But it wasn't. And she spent weeks justifying it internally, convincing herself that she shouldn't be upset, that it was just a birthday, that he had more important things to remember, that she was being childish. But after watching a lecture by Nilda Chiaraviglio, she decided to change. The following year, he forgot again. She didn't say anything. He realized 3 days later. Asked, Are you upset? And she, for the first time in 32 years, said, Yes, I am, and went silent. He waited for the explanation, waited for the justification, waited for the lecture. Nothing came. He insisted. But why? Because I am. And the conversation ended there. He was disconcerted, because he was used to explanations. Explanations that he could debate. Explanations that he could minimize. Explanations that he could invalidate. But she gave no explanation, just gave a fact. I'm upset. And facts aren't debated. Facts aren't minimized. Facts aren't invalidated. 3 days later, he bought flowers, apologized, said he wouldn't forget again. And for the first time in 32 years, she felt that the apology was genuine. Because he wasn't apologizing to end the discussion. He was apologizing because he really realized that he had hurt her. And he realized that because she didn't justify, she just felt. And that was more powerful than 1,000 explanations. Nilda Chiaraviglio says that this is the power of the mature woman who doesn't justify herself. She forces the man to deal with her reality, not with her explanation. And reality is undeniable. Explanations can be debated. Feelings can be questioned. But reality is reality. She's upset. Period. And if he wants her not to be upset anymore, he needs to change his behavior, not convince her that she shouldn't be upset. Now let's talk about a transformation that happens inside you when you stop justifying yourself. Because this isn't just about how men react. It's about how you feel. Nilda Chiaraviglio realized that women who constantly justify themselves live in a state of permanent anxiety. Because they're always worried about the other person's reaction. Always trying to predict if the explanation will be accepted. Always fearing that the justification won't be enough. And that's exhausting. It's living in constant defense mode. It's living as if you're always being judged. And you are, by yourself. But when you stop justifying yourself, something changes. You feel a lightness that you haven't felt in years. Because you're no longer carrying the weight of proving that you deserve to do what you want to do. You simply do it. And that freedom is addictive. Women who experience this say they feel like they've taken a 60-pound backpack off their backs. A backpack that they didn't even realize they were carrying. And there's an interesting side effect. When you stop justifying yourself to men, you stop justifying yourself to everyone. To your friends, to your family, to society. You develop an internal confidence that doesn't depend on external validation. And that confidence, that's what Nilda Chiaraviglio calls the magnetism of the mature woman. It's not about beauty. It's not about youth. It's about presence. It's about certainty. It's about a woman who knows who she is and doesn't apologize for it. There's a saying that Nilda repeats. Young women seduce with their bodies. Mature women seduce with their presence. And presence isn't explained. Presence is felt. And you only have presence when you stop justifying yourself. Because justification dilutes presence. Justification is noise. Presence is powerful silence. I'm going to tell you one last story. Elizabeth, 65 years old, a widow for 2 years. She started dating a man who was 67. On their second date, he asked, "Have you ever been married?" "Yes," she said. "For how long?" 28 years. And nothing more. He waited. He waited for her to tell the story. He waited for her to explain what the marriage was like. He waited for her to justify why it ended. But Elizabeth didn't do any of that. She just smiled and changed the subject. He was intrigued. On subsequent dates, he tried again. "Do you have children?" "Yes." "How many?" "2. And nothing more." He couldn't understand. All the women he'd met told their entire life story on the first date. But Elizabeth didn't. "After 2 months," he said, "I feel like I don't know anything about you." And Elizabeth replied, "You know enough." He insisted, "But I want to know more." And Elizabeth said something that changed everything. "Then earn it. Earn the right to know more. Show me that you don't want information. Show me that you want to know me. And getting to know someone takes time. It takes effort. It takes investment. And if you're willing to do that, I'm willing to let you in. But I'm not going to hand over my life on a platter to satisfy your superficial curiosity." He was silent for almost a minute. And then he said, "You're different from all the women I've ever met." And Elizabeth replied, "I know." And that was the most powerful response she could have given. Because she didn't deny it. She didn't justify it. She didn't apologize for it. She simply acknowledged, Yes, I am different. And if you want to be with me, you're going to need to adapt to that. They've been together for 3 years, and Elizabeth told me, he treats me like I'm a gift that he doesn't want to lose. Because I never gave myself completely. Not because I'm playing games, but because I understood that mystery isn't lying. Mystery is dignity. It's respect for yourself. It's understanding that not everything about you needs to be explained. That not everything about you needs to be justified. That you are a complete woman, complex, profound, and that if he wants to know that depth, he's going to need to dive in, not expect you to bring the depth to the surface. So, if you're over 50, if you've spent your life justifying yourself, if you feel like you're constantly explaining yourself, I want you to do an experiment. For 1 week, don't justify yourself. Someone asks where you are. Respond simply. Someone questions your choices. Don't explain. Someone presses for more information. Don't yield. And observe. Observe the reaction of the people around you. Observe his reaction. But, more importantly, observe your own reaction. Observe how you feel when you don't need to defend every breath you take. And if he gets uncomfortable, if he says you're different, great. Because different isn't bad. Different is interesting. Different is intriguing. Different is what keeps a mature man awake at night wondering, who is this woman? And when he's wondering that, he's not taking you for granted. He's valuing you. He's desiring you. He's pursuing you. And mature women who stop justifying themselves aren't pursued because they're running away. They're pursued because they simply are. And being, without explanations, without justifications, without apologies, is the most silent and most devastating act of power that exists. Nilda ends her lectures with a phrase, "You weren't born to justify yourself. You were born to be." And when you finally understand that, usually after 50, you become unforgettable. Not because you do something extraordinary, but because you exist in an extraordinary way. And existence isn't explained. Existence is honored. Padre Pio knew this. So stop. Stop justifying yourself. Stop explaining yourself. Stop apologizing for taking up space in the world. You are a mature woman. You've lived. You've learned. You've survived. You don't owe anyone an explanation for that. Not him. Not society. Not even yourself. You've already proven enough. Now, just be. And see how the world, especially him, reorganizes itself around your presence.